Hi, I'm Scott Lacey, a fire protection engineer with a background in both municipal and industrial firefighting, a former AHJ, the code development process, and as a consulting engineer. In this video, for the Enhanced Rural Fire Water Regulations, we're going to look at Section 5, Individual Residential Property Requirements. This training is intended as an overview of content within the regulations. Specific content wording in this video is subject to change with updates to the regulation. Please refer to the latest regulations for the current criteria. Here's a glance of the table of contents currently with Section 5. Now, Section 5 in general covers individual properties, shared individual properties, and parcel split provisions from a property owner. Now, the parcel splits of an individual or a trust are handled differently by the regulation than a subdivision, where a developer could potentially purchase the same land but then splits it for a subdivision. In that case, where it's intentionally purchased to be subdivided, that would fall under the subdivision provisions of Section 6 or 7. But under the parcel split would be where an individual property owner owns a property and due to various reasons, could be financial with property taxes or so going up from family inheritance, they're trying to split the parcel. So Section 5 would generally address that condition. However, it could be up to the HJ to determine, depending on how big the parcel is and how many acres, could be treated either condition. Each property or dwelling should have access to a water source within the hose lay. That's one of our general criteria for the regulation. The International Fire Code says water for fire operations needs to be provided. The regulation is intended to ensure that each property has water to fight fires. Provisions for hauling may be granted with specific enhancements, including sprinklers. However, it would not satisfy the creditable hydrant criteria of ISO. So one of the things we're trying to look at is with insurance criteria, is trying to make sure that each property or structure has a reliable source of water. It's become very challenging within the industry to not be able to get insurance or have multiple insurance companies if the risk is too high. So ensuring that we have reliable water is one of those means to ensure that we also will be able to get insurance and hopefully have options between insurance companies. So the goal of the regulation is to ensure that each property has a reliable source of water for firefighting. So we encourage sharing of cisterns. It's not our goal that every property has to have its own cistern and its own water supply. However, every property is intended to have access to a reliable source of water that is large enough quantity to handle that structure. So let's take an example if we're going to have 4 houses that are going to share. One house may be on 2 acres and it's 3,000 square feet. One house may be on 5 acres and it's 10,000 square feet. One house may be on 1 acre and it's 1,500 square feet. Okay, so you see the pattern here. One house may be fully sprinklered. The others are not going to be sprinklered. 1 or 2 houses may not be mitigated to low hazard, while the others are going to be mitigated to low hazard. So the scenario here, if they're going to share, we have all these different conditions. And so we've got to make sure that the water supply is appropriate, not only for just this single house, but we have other houses relying on this too that are generally adjacent to each other. So we need wildland water to protect a fire that's spreading to potentially all 4 houses, or from one house to the adjacent houses. So as you see, this can get kind of complex. Well, in the equations that works through, there's forms. It's kind of like doing your taxes and filling out the forms. You have to fill out a form, a calculation for each property. Now we say in the regulation it's generally limited to 4, and that's because we only give credit for the 4 properties. let's say an HJ is going to allow 6 properties to share a cistern. That's okay. Then what the criteria says in that case, when it is going to be allowed, is that you would do a calculation for each property, but you would only focus then on the 4 worst case conditions. You'd basically drop the 2 lower ones out of the final equations. But by doing this, it allows each property to have its own unique conditions, which again have to be documented for each property. It's essential that the water supply calculations are documented for each property, because if you have a property that says they're going to mitigate, maybe they're the biggest house with the highest quantity of water now, or let's say the lowest. Let's change that. So let's say they're the biggest house, but they say they're going to mitigate. So they actually have the lower water requirement. But then 5 years from now, they stop mitigating, or they sell the property and the property is no longer being mitigated to a low hazard, and it's got weeds and grass and trees and fuel loads all around the house, a wood deck. So now it has become a significantly higher hazard. So now that property, because we ensured that it was properly recorded in the property documents with the county as to what credits that property was going to take, they now have to reassess that and increase the water quantity for that property. Now, when you get into shared properties, that's going to become an issue. And that's where it's important that the easement and the legal documents address that. Who's going to pay for that? How is that going to be handled if somebody deviates and somebody tries to change the criteria or the requirements? Are all 4 properties now liable, or just the one that's failing to comply? So it's important that the legal documents and the deeds and so for this be addressed with those restrictions and conditions as who's going to apply it. Now, the regulation does allow for alternative sources of water versus a cistern in cases when approved or accepted by the HJ. The liabilities and the formal approvals for reliance on a municipal type system that the property owner is not a paying customer is addressed in the regulation and in section 4, and it's touched on in the other sections as well, 5, 6, and 7. But it's important to understand municipal companies are just that. A municipal water company is a company, and they have boards and they may have shareholders, and they're responsible to protect their customers. If a fire department is going to make the decision, say, hey, we're not going to require individual water for this property, we'll do haul and let them do tankers and shuttles and go a mile down the road and use the municipal hydrant that's down the road. Okay, well, if that is not a paying customer, let's say they have a well, so they're not a paying customer of that municipal department, water department, where's the liability fall in that? If the hydrant that they're supposed to have access to is not maintained or is out of service and you have a fire, who's liable? Because that house that just burned was not a paid customer, so the water department in that case probably had no obligation to provide water for that customer. So there gets to be a liability issue, and insurance and the mortgage companies are all going to get involved in that. And so setting that precedence is kind of no longer a good approach to go. That if someone's going to build a house, it's their responsibility to ensure that they have water available for firefighting. And it's kind of the goal of the jurisdiction to help ensure that that's done. So if you're going to rely on a municipal water source or somebody else's water source, maybe it's somebody else's cistern that's down the road and you don't have it piped, again, who's going to maintain that? What's the liability of doing that? So there needs to be legal documents that address that give the property owner approval and access to that water, and addresses who's liable for it, who's ensuring you have access to it, who's going to maintain it and do the inspection, testing, and maintenance. So important things to consider when you're sharing water or just saying, we're not going to make you put a cistern in, we'll do hauls from the hydrants down the street. But again, there's liability issues with who's making sure that water, that they have permission to use that water, and who's liable for it. So let's take a look at how Section 5 calculates the water quantity. The water quantity is based around the general principles of NFPA 1142, but we've simplified it to just use square footages rather than the volumes required by NFPA 1142. So 1142, you'd have to look at the volume of the structure. So basement floor versus first floor versus second floor, and where you have vaulted ceilings, the attic slope and the attic roof, those all get into the calculations of NFPA 1142. So we've simplified that and we just use square footage. Now we ran our numbers using spreadsheets to kind of compare against NFPA 1142 so that we were staying pretty much in track with that, but used a different, what we think is a little bit simpler approach. So, and we'll look at the areas for those subdivisions or those new developments that we don't know the exact square footage or areas. We'll show you how we address that in a little bit. As with NFPA 1142, encroachment within 50 foot of a structure is included. So any other structures within 50 foot of the primary structure, those areas need to be included, whether that be a shed, a chicken coop, an outdoor kitchen area. Those would all get factored into that encroachment areas. Now, we realize we don't know today versus what the homeowner is going to add later. So again, we look at ranges. We'll look at that in a little bit with the table as we have ranges of, instead of an exact square footage, we kind of go within ranges and you should round up. Or what happens when you still don't know what that range is going to be. If the developer is not going to put limits and say, okay, no houses can be greater than 5,000 square foot in this subdivision. Well, if it's going to be unlimited, then we have additional factors to look at for that. So we'll address that and look at examples here in a little bit. Our water quantity includes increases for wildfire protection and defense based on mitigation levels. So unlike traditional codes of both NFPA and the International Fire Code that only look at the structures, we are taking into account the wildland interface. And the general code criteria is we're looking at for low level of mitigation, or is it going to be medium to higher level hazards or mitigation levels. So it's important that we look at the mitigation of what's being done around the property and around the house, and the trees being cut and trimmed all becomes a factor. And it's essential that the developer or the homeowner commit to that up front. So if they do not commit to it or they do not follow it, then there is basically provisions for stop work. So if they start building the house and they have not done the mitigation that they've committed to, then the HJ or the authority can stop work and require them to go ahead and provide the water levels for that higher level of protection. They were given the chance. If they started construction and failed to do that, and we know that basically at that point we can't rely on that. So the code or the regulation is written such that at that point the property owner or the developer is required to increase the water level to the moderate or high level criteria. And mitigation needs to be done before combustible materials are brought on site and the construction started. Based around the home, the water quantity is based around the home and hobby use. So if they're going to be operating a business or a higher hazard, that's going to require a separate evaluation for additional water. So let's say out of their house, they're going to put a shop out back and start rebuilding cars. If that's just a hobby, that's one thing. If it now turns into a business where they have tons of cars lined up and they are repairing cars, that is no longer just a homeowner or a hobby use. That now has become a business use, and the hazards need to be reevaluated. So within the regulation, one of the handouts in the appendix helps with establishing this encroachment area, the calculations, as well as the mitigation criteria. So let's take a look at this example, and we'll cover a number of different factors. So we have the primary structure. You see the exterior walls, and we talk about the roof line. So the dotted lines in here would be the interior walls basically, and then we have the overhang of the eave, And here we have a patio, covered patio on the back. So the area we're interested in is the roof line, which is not going to be the same as what's advertised in the conditioned space or the real estate criteria. So the real estate criteria may promote this as a 3,000 square foot house. However, we're looking at the roof line, and then we're also going to look at each floor, and that includes basements, either unfinished or finished. Unfinished basements often have a higher fuel load than a finished basement. So we're going to look at the total square footage of each floor, including the roof line for the upper floor. We're also looking at any roof lines or areas within the 50-foot encroachment. So if we have a shed or a chicken coop or an outdoor kitchen area, any of these areas that are within a 50-foot encroachment of that structure, that area needs to be accounted for. Now, we may not know in the future that this is going to happen. If this shows up and this outdoor kitchen gets installed later, the owner is then responsible to reevaluate the structure to establish if that's going to impact. It may or may not have any impact on their water supply. So if anything, when the calculations are done, you need to assume higher and round up to avoid these smaller hazards. Now, if we have something outside the 50-foot encroachment, as an example here, where we have a detached shop or garage, but it's 50 feet or more from the structure, then that area does not have to get calculated in. Unless this shop, for example, becomes a larger square footage than your primary structure, now that square footage is what's going to drive the water supply. So we don't need to add these up, but we need to look at the worst case of which area is larger is going to drive, and that's assuming they're 50 foot apart. If this was 40 feet away, now the square footage of the shop needs to be added into the square footage of the residence, the outdoor kitchen, and the shed. Now, other examples of mitigation, and this is not hard because the jurisdictions may have different criteria. There's different criteria for mitigation depending on FireWise or which source you go to look at, but this is intended to give you examples that small bushes need to be at least 8 foot from the structure. Some jurisdictions will define what kind of bushes that can be based on their typical water content and what their fuel loading is going to be, how hot they're going to burn. So that may impact what bushes could be, say, at 8 foot or one needs to be 10 or 15 foot. So jurisdictions are going to vary. Trees basically need to be kept away from the structure. The lower limbs generally have to be trimmed up at least 6 to 8 foot. Some may require higher. So this is just a concept of how to protect your structure, how you're going to harden your structure. If you have a wood deck, a combustible wood deck, that becomes a fuel hazard and that becomes an issue. So to use the low intensity criteria, you could not have a combustible wood deck on the house. You would need to go to a treated, limited to non-combustible deck. Combustible fences, wood fences that come up to the house, those are issues. Those are fuel sources. Mulch, whether it be wood mulch or rubber mulch, is a fuel source that cannot be against the house. So you're generally looking at rock type landscaping for so many feet away from the house. So understanding those mitigation criteria of how we're going to protect this house. And what's important to understand is that you should be able to have a fire come up to this house and get close, but not impact the house. Firefighters are tasked with enough on their hands to go around trying to protect every house, every structure. If the structure is properly mitigated, then they don't have to be coming up here and ripping out your wood deck, because that's what's going to happen in some cases. If the firefighters come in here to protect the structure, they're going to come up and rip out the wood deck, rip out the fence, cut it down, pull it away from the house, and get those fuel loads away from the house. So the idea is that we need to build our houses to be hardened and anticipate the fire up front. Now we have an acceptable parking area. We indicate right here, so the hose lay from the water source to an acceptable parking area. So generally we're looking at 40 to 60 feet from the structure. It would be like on the driveway, or if we had turnaround in front of the house, wherever we designate that acceptable parking area for measuring. and then the hose lay from the truck to around the property. So in the regulation, the general criteria is that from a water source to this acceptable parking area needs to be no more than 900 feet. And then 300 feet from the truck, from this acceptable parking area, to get around any part of the structure within 300 feet. Any structure needs to have a truck hose lay within 900 feet. So if there's, say, a shed or a small barn that's way back out here somewhere, if it can be handled by tank water, and this is going to be up to the jurisdiction to establish, but if they can handle that within tank water, they still have to be able to get the truck within 300 feet, but they would not have to get the hose lay within, say, the 900 foot, and then also the truck within 300 foot. So there's criteria in the regulation that kind of addresses that for small incidental structures that can be handled with the water that's on the truck. You still have to have a path to be able to get the truck within the 300 feet though. Once we establish the square footage area that's going to be applicable to the house, we go to the table 5.4, which is key to starting with establishing what the minimum gallons of water is required for fire protection. So when we look at the table, first column here, we notice the largest area of combined structures not having 50-foot separation. So meaning all those areas that are within the 50-foot encroachment, that total area comes to this table to see where it lands within these ranges. So let's say we have a 3,000 square foot house. Now, keep in mind, we need to make sure we're not too close to the edge. So if we have 3,000 square feet, and that already accounts for the shed and the outdoor kitchen area, we got 100 square foot to spare here, we might be okay. But if this does not include a future shed or an outdoor kitchen area that may be planned in the future, we may want to jump to the next section. Anytime we increase the area within that 50-foot encroachment, it's going to have to be reevaluated to assess and see if that changes the water supply. So again, we want to make sure that we allow a little bit of a cushion to address that up front with the tank sizing versus having to install a whole separate tank later when we could just go to a larger tank now. So if we start with a 3,000 square foot house, that's the number we're going to use, is 3,000 square feet. Now, assuming we're doing low intensity mitigation, so we have reduced the mitigation and the hazard around the property, and we're from 0 to 2.5 acres, we would need 10,000 gallons of water. Now, if we were not going to do low intensity mitigation, and that puts us into the moderate to high intensity acreage. So let's say we have a 2-acre house. We had a 2-acre property with a 3,000 square foot house at low intensity. It requires 10,000 gallons of water. Now, if we go to a 2-acre house with a 3,000 square foot house without mitigation, we now are required to have a minimum of 25,000 gallons of water. So that's an increase of 15,000 gallons from the 10,000 to the 25,000. Now let's say we have a 5-acre property. So we're on 5 acres and we're not going to mitigate to low hazard. Okay, we go in this range here. That puts us at 35,000 gallons. Now, if we're going to mitigate for low intensity, it says see footnotes for low intensity acreage. See footnote number 4. And there's other footnotes that apply as well. But if we go down here to footnote number 4, it says where the wooded acreage is mitigated in accordance with recognized criteria and acceptable to the AHJ to limit the hazard in footnote 3, then the volume of water may be reduced 2 columns to the left, but shall not be reduced less than that required for a structure with low intensity acreage. So again, we said we had 5 acres with a 3,000 square foot house. So we come over to this table, find the 5-acre section, which is 35,000 gallons. However, because we're going to mitigate and we're going to commit to mitigating it to low intensity, we go 2 columns to the left, which now says even for a 5-acre property that's low intensity with a 3,000 square foot house, we only need 15,000 gallons of water. So a difference here of 20,000 gallons of water, which is about basically the size of one cistern, depending on the size of your cistern, difference for doing low hazard mitigation. So let's say we have an acre, we're on 12 acres. We're greater than 10, so we're on 12 acres. Same situation. If we're not going to mitigate, we need 50,000 gallons of water. If we're going to mitigate and commit to mitigating before construction starts, we go 2 columns to the left, which means we now need 25,000 gallons of water to protect that 12 acres with a 3,000 square foot house. So it's important to evaluate this and make sure the mitigation. You see here how critical the mitigation is. So as an example, in the state of Colorado, with the legal requirements for the wildland mitigation or wildland interface code, mitigation is already required. But this is where you also see the benefits of that mitigation. Now it's important, you'll also see in footnote 4, it says to apply this credit, these terms that are agreed to needs to be documented on the legal documents for that property. So it needs to be recorded with a county system or somewhere, again, as an agreement that they committed to taking these credits and maintaining that level of protection. So in the future, either that property owner or when it's sold and they fail to maintain the credits, then what happens is they basically, per the regulation and code, they lose their certificate of occupancy until such time as they upgrade the water supply requirements to address the hazard. So that's why you'll also find in the code it's required that the mitigation has to be complete before construction starts and combustible materials are brought on site. If they commit to doing low intensity mitigation, but they failed to do that and they've started construction, then the regulation allows for a stop work order to be issued until such time as they upgrade the water supply. Now, per the regulation, it's not a matter of stopping work until they mitigate. No, they already had the chance to mitigate. Per the regulation, the way it's written right now, is they would have to go ahead and increase the water supply before they could resume construction. So that's one of those issues that's going to have to be addressed and dealt with the AHJ and through the permitting system. But it's important to make sure that the mitigation is done up front. And it should be done and verified ideally before building permits are issued. It should be inspected, the site inspected and verified that all mitigation is done before they even get a building permit to bring combustible materials on site. So this is a good example of how to apply this table using the credits. Make sure you look at all the footnotes that are applicable, but also make sure that you understand and see the benefit of mitigation and how that's going to help you in your reduced water supply requirements. Now, for individual properties, we'll take a look at how the sprinkler credit equation works. Some very important concepts to understand in this. Now, just at first glance, you'll notice that per this section, the water supply volume may be reduced by a maximum of 50% using the formula below. However, you got to understand that this formula, which you don't have to get bogged down with this formula because the worksheets in Appendix D will walk you through this calculation process. But what's important to understand is that you're only getting sprinkler credits for the portions that are sprinklered. So you have to know the areas of the house that will be sprinklered. The shed out back, the kitchen, outdoor kitchen cooking area or gazebo that is not sprinklered, you do not get credit for that with the sprinkler credits. If you do not sprinkler your garage, you do not get credits for that garage. So you have to look at your areas for the sprinklered areas to then figure out the ratio up to the non-sprinklered areas to figure out on the Appendix D worksheets, the calculation sheets, will walk you through to establish that. Again, make sure you're understanding you're only getting up to 50% credit for the areas of the structure, the square footage areas that are sprinklered. If you do not sprinkler the basement, if you do not sprinkler the garage, if that's allowed per the criteria or the NFPA standards, then you will not get credit for those non-sprinklered areas. So after we've established the square footage area with the encroachments, and we've established the quantity from table 5.4 of how many gallons of water we need to take that to the calculation forms in Appendix D. So in Appendix D, there are several pages of these forms to do calculations. Now, this particular one is an example. It's already filled in, and there's copies of these in Appendix D as well. So you notice on this one, we have property 1 calculation, and then we have property 2 calculation. Now, if you only have one property that you're assessing, you only need to fill out the top part of this form, answer the questions appropriately, which are going to address whether it's sprinklered or not sprinklered, what's the mitigation levels. If it is sprinklered, what's the ratio as to how much of the property is sprinklered versus how much of the property is not sprinklered. These are some of the different factors that will be addressed through here to come out with what your final quantity is in gallons for that particular property. Now on this slide, we're looking at the next pages, which has property 3 calculations and property 4 calculations. So again, if we're only doing one property or if we're doing 2 properties, we only need the previous page. If we're going to assess 4 properties, we fill this out. Each field of these are identical when we assess the required water for each individual property. If we're going to do more than 4 properties, and the HJ has allowed more than 4 properties to share, such as 6 properties, then you have to fill out the calculations for all 6 properties. Only the worst 4 will go forward to the next step. So the 2 smaller quantity of waters would drop out, and you'd keep the highest quantity of water, those worst case 4 properties, to go into the next step on the next page. Now when we get to this page of the calculation forms, you'll see where we enter in the adjusted water quantity for each of the properties. Now if you only have 3, you only put in 3 here. If you have 4, you put in 4. If you have 1, you don't need to apply this because this page will not apply. This is only when you're sharing properties. So it shows to enter the number from line 15 on the form for each of those other properties. And then we come in here and we do the calculations to address the quantities. So depending on how many properties, and in this case 4, there's a factor in the regulation. So we address that factor, and in this case it's shown on the form, and this is subject to change. So these are the numbers currently, but make sure you use the numbers for your current regulation that's adopted. And with 4, we get a credit of 0.6 for the 4 shared properties. So when we calculate this out, we come up with a final number. So you'll see in this case, the adjusted number says that we're going to need 53,700 gallons, okay, which is less than the 89,500 gallons that would have otherwise been required for all 4 properties. So, and then there's another equation that we talked about earlier where you evaluate in case this number is low, you have to do a cross check and make sure that this final number is at least 125% higher than the worst case individual property. which in this case would be 37,500 gallons. So in no case are we going to be less than 125% of the worst case condition. However, in this case with the credits, it's based on mitigation and sprinkler factors and different considerations. Acreage comes into play. So the value of 53,700 gallons is going to be required. Now, in some of the criteria, it is necessary to look at the flows. And this could even be establishing for a municipal type water supply per Section 3. If we need to establish what the flow is going to be required for the utility to provide, do we need 250 gallons per minute or do we need 500 gallons per minute? This information is provided in here in Section 5.5 to help with that. It also can be used by the engineer if you've got an engineer establishing what the flow demand needs to be. And this is generally going to be where we're using a main extension. So let's say we've got 4 properties, but one of them is more than the 900 foot. So we've got to provide a hydrant line or a dry hydrant type standpipe system, let's say, to pump from the cistern further up the road to get to that last house. So this is where some of that will come into play, as establishing what size pipe based on what flow is needed for that property. I hope you found this useful. I know it was quick and it was a crash course just to kind of go over Section 5 and give you a general concept of how the quantities of water are determined in Section 5 based on the square footages and the encroachments. So please make sure you look at the regulation for your jurisdiction, as this is only intended as an overview and some criteria may change, the numbers may change. But again, it provides you a general concept of how to calculate the required quantity of water for the particular structure or structures if they're sharing properties. In the examples here, we use the 900-foot hose lays. That's what's in the right now in the base requirements of the regulation. Local jurisdictions and Appendix E may amend that. So if your jurisdiction only carries 500 foot of hose, you may amend that in the Section E or Appendix E to say that the house has to be within 400 foot of the acceptable parking area to the water source. So refer to Section E for jurisdictions, local amendments that may be either less restrictive or more restrictive than the base criteria in the regulation.